Ramez Naam. Now Ramez Naam is an author of 3 books. One of them is coming out very soon called Nexus, and another one which is coming out maybe July next year, April next year, and is of course the well-known author from the book More Than Human. So I'll just push you over to Ramez. Okay. Put your hands together for Ramez Naam.
I have advanced technology. Alright, so I'm going to talk fast about inner space and outer space. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, first, who am I? Adam already told you this. More Than Human is a book I wrote a long time ago. Nexus is my sci-fi novel about a nanobot that goes into your brain and gives you telepathy. It comes out in 18 days. And I should also say that I'm just super excited to be here because we have a conference about writing about the future, and Anna Lee, who's going to speak next, is probably responsible, ultimately, for more words written about the future in any given month than maybe anyone else on the planet, actually. And Max Moore, who will be here later, was one of the first people I read who introduced me to futurism back when I was a kid. And James is also awesome, and hopefully they'll all be here very soon. Okay, so this is the canonical vision of the future. If you go read some sci-fi, watch some sci-fi, there is some stuff that is about the topics I'll talk about, but the majority of it is about space, and space is great. I love Star Trek, I love this sort of thing. When you look through big, successful books in the science fiction genre over the last several years, they're also largely set in space. I love Alistair Reynolds, John Scalzi's Old Man's War was great. Hyperion, maybe my favorite science fiction book of all time. All of these are about people being out on other planets, other star systems, and engaging in large-scale things there. And in fact, we've been talking about this for a very, very long time. A lot of the early classics in sci-fi are set in space, going back to possibly the first space opera ever, the Skylarker Space, which Doc Smith started writing in 1915 and was originally finally published in 1928, and talked about interstellar travel. Okay? So for a very, very, very long time, we've been talking about this, going into space and living there, and so on. But it's starting to get a little disappointing to some people. So my friend Daniel Wilson wrote this book a few years ago called Where's My Jetpack? Basically said, what happened? We were promised jetpacks, we were promised space travel, and it just didn't happen. And in fact, if you look at the trends, for a while it looked very promising. This is a graph that Alex Knapp at Ford put together of the speed records of craft in the atmosphere, of aircraft. And for a while, in the 50s and 60s, we went from propellers to jet aircraft. We started breaking the speed of sound, and it looked very, very promising. And then since about the 1970s, there's been essentially no progress in this metric whatsoever. This is the number of people per year who have been launched into space. And what you see again is that there's a large spike early on in the 60s, and then since then there's essentially no change. So we have this vision of the future as going into space, living into space, but it doesn't seem to be what's happening. And Randall Munroe at SACD put this down, even more depressing, if you will, on this score, that if you look at the number of people who are still alive who ever walked on the moon, or any other celestial body, which the moon's the one we've walked on, it's actually dropping over time as former astronauts are dying off. And he then, being Randall Munroe, put in the actuarial table showing his projection of how many people would have would still be alive who walked on any other body, and projects that without major life extension or a renewed space race, by 2035 they'll all be gone. Now, there are some bad reasons for this. There are some policy issues. There are some choices we've made that lead to this. But also the fact that it's just really, really, really hard. If you look at the ratio of payload and vehicle to fuel in a spacecraft, it's about the ratio of the can of Coke, the aluminum of it, to the contents. And it takes a lot of energy to get people into space, and we haven't really reduced that. We haven't built a space elevator yet. We haven't found a way to make that radically cheaper. On the other hand, things in other domains have changed dramatically. We all know about Moore's Law, and the amount of computing we have available to us has gone up hugely over time? Well, it turns out it's not just computers, it's also biology. The blue line going down is Moore's law. This red line going, the cost of computing. This red line going down is the cost of gene sequencing. And this black line going up is the cost, is the number of human genomes sequenced. And we now have more human genomes sequenced than we ever sent humans into space. And that ratio will keep on increasing over time. So this is the sort of science that's actually going to affect more people. And there is some science fiction written about this, but it's not the majority. The future, for most people, is more about science going into smaller domains instead of bigger domains. And it's more about bits, whether those bits be in computers or in our own DNA or something else, than it is about atoms. So we already live in the future, it turns out. This thing called the iPhone was not nearly as common in classic science fiction as space vehicles were. It actually affects our lives a whole lot more. And a lot more is coming in these domains. Let me just talk about two domains that I think are pretty relevant that will affect the lives of billions of people going forward. One is mastering the human genome, which we're starting on, and the other is the interfacing of minds and machines. So, the human genome. Richard Dawkins was once asked if he could sum up biology in one word. The word he chose was digital, which is to say that the human genome is mostly a construct of information. It happens to be encoded in physical matter, as all information is, but it's really about the information content. When you look at a modern sequencing system, it looks an awful lot like a computer, because mostly that's what it is, actually. Craig Venter, who led the private sector approach to sequencing the human genome, I had a chance to hear him speak a few years ago, and he said on stage that his most important research tool was the computer. That's what it all came down to. Not only do individual sequencing workstations look like computers, sequencing centers look sort of like data centers, actually. They look sort of like old data centers, let's say. They haven't gone to high-density racks, but they probably will. All right, so you've seen this graph already. Because of this dropping cost of genome sequencing, this fellow, George Church, is one of the pioneers of human genome, one of the people who proposed the Human Genome Project actually. He projects that by 2020 we'll have 100,000 human genomes sequenced, as opposed to the several thousand perhaps that we have right now. But he's probably wrong, actually, because on current trend, the cost of genome sequencing by 2020 will be on the order of a few dollars. So let's buffer that a little bit and say it'll be the $10 genome. Well, that would allow us to sequence millions of genomes. Millions of individual humans to help pick out the variations between us that make us who we are, but also every mammal species. Only about 5,000 mammal species on the planet right now. There are only a few million species total known. We have the wherewithal to actually sequence almost all life that we know of within a decade or 2 decades from now. That will give us lots of data to mine, which gets into that other area where we have exponential growth, which is computing, and which makes very pretty graphs with good genome analysis. This is our rice genome, actually. And what will we find? Well, we know that humans are substantially, our traits are impacted by our genes, not entirely in any domain. Even our height isn't 100% genetic, only 87% in the US of variation in height is explained by genetics, but it's still very substantial. And more interestingly, traits that we don't think of as genetic at all, like personality axes of openness to experience and conscientiousness, are also highly correlated between twins who are raised apart, for instance. So any trait that is somewhat genetic is amenable to being modified in humans. Knowing, of course, is only half the battle, as G.I. Joe taught us. The other half is doing. So if the genome is digital, can we edit it? Like we can edit any sort of digital media that we have on our computer? Sometimes we can. A couple years ago, this was the cover of The Economist magazine that celebrated the creation of the first synthetic life form. That was done by Craig Venter, right here, who some have accused of having a God complex, so I found him very sweet. What Venter and his team did was they printed a genome of 1 million base pairs that was about 400 and some genes, and inserted it into an E. coli, and that organism lived. It actually printed out all of that DNA. Now, genome printing also has a Moore's Law-like phenomena going on. And if we take the extension of their technology and say, how long will it be till they can print a whole human genome? Well, the longest human chromosome, chromosome 1, is 250 million base pairs long. And do the math, that's about 2020 they'll be able to print any human chromosome at a high cost, print the entire DNA to order of a human being with exactly the set of genes they want and don't want. And then if they wanted to, insert that into a hollowed out fertilized egg and produce a human being with whatever qualities you want. This is going to affect more lives and more society than space travel will for the foreseeable future. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I'm not a hollowed out fertilized egg. I have 1 trillion cells. So does this have any relevance to me? Well, maybe. Nature has copied this idea we have of computer viruses and created these things that deliver information to cells. The other way around, obviously. But viruses are information carriers. They are editors of the genome that carry information in. And through mastery of viruses and other technologies, we are learning to actually edit the genome. We have gene therapies that restore vision to the congenitally blind. We have gene therapies that take congenital defects that lead to heart failure and reduce the likelihood of those by inserting new genes. There's about 200 different gene therapies in clinical trials right now. Most of those will fail in clinical trials, but the estimation is that something like 10 or 20 of those will, over the next decade, get approved. And in fact, just last month, we had the first approval of a gene therapy in Europe. So now for the first time, as a normal patient, you can walk into a clinic or a hospital and have your parts of your genome edited to cure a disease. And we know of many ways where existing genetic variation in animals or genetic changes that we've made affect them. On the right, in the upper right, this is a Belgian blue bull. And this bull is, you can see, it's hugely muscular because it has a mutation in its myostatin gene that renders it ineffective. Myostatin only suppresses muscle growth. So we know that this happens, and in fact if you do this to mice as well, insert this intentionally, you end up with mice that are super muscly. This mouse has a mutation that we've inserted of a gene called p-delta, and it has about twice the aerobic endurance of other mice. And there's every indication that we could do this to humans as well. This fellow, Iro Montirata, won the 1964 gold medal in cross-country skiing. He actually won 5 gold medals that year, and his uncle is an Olympic gold medalist too. Well, it's not just because they had great training or great discipline. It turns out his family carries a mutation of a gene called EPO that means that they all have more red blood cells than normal people would. And when we've inserted this gene into baboons, we found that those baboons end up super athletic as well for the entirety of their lives. Now, Lee Sweeney, who was pictured with that Belgian blue bull, is a researcher working on muscular dystrophy. That's why he's interested in myostatin. But when you talk to him, he says that half the emails he gets are from athletes. Actually, this is from a few years ago. So it's probably 3/4 or more now. And this technology is not actually that hard. It's especially hard to ensure that it's safe, but to actually do it is the sort of thing that a grad student could pull off. You could imagine a garage-scale lab to do it. So I would say there are pretty good odds that the first genetically enhanced athletes are here already. One of the other things about this technology that makes it interesting is that it's very, very difficult to scan for. You can scan for blood doping by taking a blood test, but you cannot scan for these genetic changes without doing a muscle biopsy, which is not done in the Olympics or in baseball or in football. We've also made animals smarter. There's a Doogie mouse that learns things in 1 repetition that take other mice 5. So there's huge things that we can do in inner space. I'm going to skip forward and keep us moving. So my book, Nexus, is about inserting nanotech into the brain that can connect mind to mind. And that sounds like mega science fiction, but in fact, things like this are happening already. This is a scientist named Jose Delgado, who in the 1960s was experimenting with direct brain implants in animals. What you see in this picture is He's got a remote control, and this bull has a small controller on its head with electrodes stuck into its brain. And the bull is kind of leaning forward. It's not very happy that Delgado's there. And the next frame, Delgado has hit the button on his remote control and stopped the bull dead in its tracks. Now this is a kind of a creepy use, and after this, the technology fortunately took a turn towards the more medical applications. Today, almost 100,000 people have cochlear implants that don't broadcast sound into the ear. They actually pass electrical signals into the auditory nerve to inform the brain of what's happening. And while they have only 23 electrodes, there are 30,000 auditory nerves in the auditory channel, but it still works pretty well. This fellow, Jens Baumann, made the cover of Wired magazine several years ago. He's 40 years old in this picture. He's been blind since age 19. And he's got a little CCD camera here that goes to a computer on his hip that then in turn goes to a bundle of 256 wires that go into his primary visual cortex. Now, the visual cortex has about 1 billion neurons in it, give or take, more or less. And this only has 256 electrodes, so you wouldn't think this could work at all. But in fact, it does do something called limited mobility vision. So what does that look like? So this is a man who's been blind for 21 years, driving a Mustang convertible in a parking lot. Now, I was not in that parking lot, and you'll notice there are no cars there. His vision sucks. His vision is a 16 by 16 grid of pixels, but that's a very large step up from 0. So this is all proof of concept that we can do this sort of thing. We've taken motor cortex implants and given people the ability to control cursors on screens. Let me keep moving. We are recently working with memory and other things. An amazing study that came out just the other day, just about a month or two ago, was on a test of attention and memory and decision making. They trained rhesus monkeys to take this test, and how well they could do, they measured. Then they had a set where they implanted a prefrontal cortex implant that actually they found augmented their performance by about 10% on this test. Now this implant wasn't a general implant that made you smarter. It was actually finely tuned to the specific task they were doing. But this is probably the first time we found something that we can actually implant in a brain of an animal at least and have it do better on a test of mental performance than was possible before. So there's amazing things happening in this. The other area that I think is really right is communication. It started out with computers we started out with computers as devices for computing, for local work. But the way that they've really changed the world is via communication with others. That's what they're primarily used for now. And in the brain, it turns out, imagination, sensation, and memory are all encoded in very, very similar ways. For the most part, the same neurons fire when you see something, when you remember it, and when you imagine it. That opens the door to having read-write of information in and out of the brain. If we can send images into the brain, then we should be able to read them out and pump them to a computer, a drawing program, or to someone else's brain. And in fact, we have some early indications that this is possible. So this, which some of you may have seen, is a image on the left is what's being shown to a patient, and a system using an MRI to scan their brain and then trained on a bunch of other images is reconstructing what they're seeing based on their brain activity on the right. And you'll see it's not a very good reconstruction. They chose kind of an odd way to go about doing it, but at a bulk level, they were able to tell what it was this person was looking at. So we're approaching the age of being able to read-write the data in and out of the brain. So I'm going to just skip towards the punchlines since we're running late a little bit here. There are huge things that we can do to ourselves, and we're making faster progress in those than we are in going into space. Going into space is mostly about using more energy, with some exceptions. There are definitely major things we can do, but largely it's a very intensive process of using more energy to move more matter. Whereas the modifications we're making to ourselves that affect us all very deeply are mostly about more information rather than more effort, if you will. So the stars almost certainly belong to our descendants, and I'd say the solar system does too. I think the likelihood that we ever have a colony of human beings on Mars is very low compared to the notion that we have post-humans of some sort, whether they be biological or digital, who are living there at some point in the future. And to their credit, some science fiction authors have tackled this. Greg Egan and his space opera Diaspora, it's not flesh and blood human beings that are going out there in this world. It's uploads, digital uploads of human beings that are doing this, which is a far more plausible thing to do. Now, why does this matter at all? And I say this as somebody who loves space opera and loves fantasy set in space. It matters because one thing that science fiction has done well over the years, not the only thing, not its only purpose for existence, but one important thing is help prepare us for the future by letting us explore these possibilities that could come to be and letting us come to grips with them, letting us explore what we think about them morally and ethically and how society should work. And we've seen it. Some of the oldest science fiction is an example of what David Brin has talked about as a self-defeating prophecy, as one of the most important things you can do with science fiction. So you'll notice that in the information industry and the computer industry, people are very largely anti-surveillance. And there's a large sentiment in certain directions. And I think that some of that stems to the work that happened in 1984. Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World. Whether you agree with what's in all these books or not, I don't agree with all that much of Brave New World, but it addressed something that was a technological plausibility and talked about the bad things that could come to light with that. And by doing so, I think it made those negative outcomes less likely. And so that's why I'd like to see more of this. We need preparations, because many of these things that science will actually bring to us, longer lives, enhanced abilities, the ability to edit our own personalities or beliefs, our brains online, the ability to copy ourselves, those things have major consequences. What happens with our civil liberties? Who can make the decisions about these things or not? Will it be in our hands, government hands, corporate hands? What happens to our economies? Will these technologies tend to bring less inequality or more? What's the shape of our society? What does it even mean to be human if I can decide, oh, I'm too introverted, I'm going to take a pill or hit a button so I'm more of an extrovert? What does that mean? So I think we see more great stories in outer space, but I also hope that we see more science fiction that explores the transformation of inner space, of our genes, our lifespans, our minds, and what that means for the world. And I hope you'll check out my story that explores some of that, and particularly civil liberties in an age of being able to modify and link our brains. So, thanks very much.
Would you like to take a question?
Sure.
Anybody want to ask a question? Behind you.
Yeah. You were just mentioning how important it is to think about things in advance and for writers to give us an idea of the sort of things that you might want to think about ahead of time. And I'm just wondering, just from your knowledge of futurist writers and science fiction writers throughout, I guess, the last decades, do you find in general that they pointed in the right direction, or that in some cases we've been kind of misled to think about the wrong sort of problems rather than the right problems?
It's a good question. I think that in general, sci-fi, I agree with Neil Stephenson and what he's been saying lately, that sci-fi is usually too pessimistic. But it is for a reason, which is that you have narrative and plot, and if everything's going really, really well, there's usually not that much tension. That said, I think there's a couple examples that I give. One, just longer term. You see the very classic sci-fi, 1984, Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World. The big thing that those books were really about was totalitarianism. That's what they were really about. And technology was the lens that cast a political light on that, which I think was awesome. More recently, I'd say that my first real awareness of climate change came from science fiction. So David Brin's Earth, John Barnes' Mother of Swarms were two of the books. I never read a nonfiction book on climate change until years and years and years later. So they're both a little bit outside the decade span. I think that was an example of sci-fi being effectively used to raise an issue that was relevant.
One more?
Yep. William Gibson writes about a future that is current. because he feels that his own capacity of projecting out a far future is impeded, whether by the technological singularity or whatever other reasons. And the slope of change implied by inner space technologies is even steeper than those more traditional space opera types. So would you expect writers about inner space to be even faster meeting these potential limits?
I do think that writers in inner space are going to set more things in the near future. At the same time, while there are these exponential trends, a lot of the problems are really, really, really hard. So protein folding, if you throw exponentially increasing computing at it, you get a little bit better than linear progress, for instance. So just because our computing ability or other abilities are going up exponentially does not mean that the world changes exactly on a dime. There are still very hard problems, and I think it will be, at least decades in the future before there's really a horizon we can't look over.
Thanks very much, Ramez.